anniversary. First, I would like to speak a few words about the center and its activities. As all of you know, Social Policy Analysis Research Center is affiliated to the Faculty of Arts, University of Colombo. It functions as one of the focal points within the Sri Lankan university system that explores critical areas of social and economic development. Activities of SPARC are centered on research, training, advocacy, and networking. From its inception, SPARC has worked in diverse fields of study, such as social integration of youth, community-based poverty monitoring, and disaster resilience. The center facilitates close collaboration between academics and institutions outside the university system, including governmental, non-governmental, and private agencies. I would like to take this opportunity to briefly introduce our speaker for today's session, Professor Felix Ringel. He's an assistant professor in social anthropology at Durham University. He obtained his PhD from Sydney Sussex College, Cambridge, and held a fixed-term lectureship at the University of Vienna from 2012 to 2016. He was awarded the Marie Curie Fellowship at Durham University from 2016 to 2019. He has authored a number of international journal articles and book chapters. Professor Ringel's research interests include time, sustainability, and urban development in post-industrial Europe. Prior to starting the session, I kindly request all participants to abide by the following set of guidelines to ensure minimum disturbances during the session. Kindly keep your mics muted until the end of the session. Any questions can be raised during the question and answer session after the lecture. Participants can either ask the questions verbally or send them as a message. We look forward to your cooperation in this regard. While thanking Professor Ringel for his time and for sharing his knowledge with us, I would also like to thank everyone joining us today. I hope that this session will be fruitful and beneficial to all participants. Thank you. Over to you, Felix.
Thanks, Nishara. It's nice seeing you again. It would be nice seeing the others too, but I'm sure there's internet kind of issues lurking in the background, so don't worry. But thanks for the invitation, Nishara, and thanks for the kind introduction. It's a real pleasure to be with you again, this time virtually, but I really enjoyed our tour last year in October when I made it actually to Sri Lanka, so I at least have an idea of where we should be sitting right now rather than in front of these laptops that we're staring into. Good, I will start sharing my screen. I'll bring my PowerPoint up. Just give me 1 second. And let me know whether you can see this.
Yes, we can see, yes.
Good.
It's
and you can hear me well as well, is that correct?
Yes, yeah.
Excellent, thank you so much. Good, I'll just dive in. So I want to talk about time today. I'm obviously a social anthropologist, but the wonderful work, and again, congratulations for 15 years of doing such wonderful work. The work you do at your center are interdisciplinary, so this is more an invitation to all of you from your different disciplinary backgrounds to think again how we do relate to time and the future, not just in general, but also right now in what we have called or come to call the Anthropocene, which is a very specific way of thinking about the world, I think, and also the way it is changing. So just to give you a quick preview of what's going to happen, I'm going to give a very short introduction and I'll take you to my two field sites. That's exactly what anthropologists would do. They are, as Nishara has said, two post-industrial cities in Europe, but the idea of what kind of post-industrial refers to also applies obviously beyond Europe. There's a few things that we can talk about in this regard, but I want to focus on future issues and particularly on the idea of sustainability. So one kind of idea that many people have to deal with right now is that we kind of have to recalibrate the metaphysics, our kind of more general understandings of time and space in the social sciences more generally, and that's due to a lot of things. One of the people who kind of put forward that kind of argument is Deepesh Chakravarty, who in the book that you can see here, The Climate of History and the Planetary Age, tells us that the Anthropocene in and of itself challenges our core notions of space, time, particularly the future, but also of power and our own agency. It does so in many ways. First of all, it does invite us to see the place we are living in as part of a more planetary, not just global, but a planetary system. which has its own effects on how we think about human agency then, and how much we are entangled with this world. So it has spatial repercussions mostly, but it also has temporal repercussions. It's not just because it invites us to think of the era we are living in from a geological point of view, so some kind of a point of view that takes into consideration millions of years usually, by thinking through what kind of sediments we will leave behind for future generations if humanity survives yet to come. But what I'm more interested in when it comes to the temporal implications of thinking with and in the Anthropocene is the idea of the future, because the future has obviously been rendered problematic in many different ways. Now, sustainability in and of itself, and I know many people can be very critical of that term, kind of promises a salvation to this era. It seems to be the kind of most prominent and promising idea of the future that we can hold currently, for several reasons, three of them being the following. One is it seems to take us beyond the kind of ideas of growth and decline that have dominated modernity, global modernity for decades now. It also seems to take humanity outside of an idea of history and change by creating something that can be seen as a self-sustaining, a continuous present that does not produce any future harm for future generations. So it's in and of itself the main answer that we have yet come up with to the challenges of the Anthropocene when it comes to envisioning a different future. Now, whether that really works in particular context is obviously open for discussion, and I'm going to take you to two contexts in which the future has been rendered problematic, not just by Anthropocene issues, but by other issues as well. In these two cities, it would be the post-industrial kind of situation that they found themselves in, the crisis basically that was sparked by the post-industrial era. So let me take you to Hoyerswerda first and talk about issues of how we as anthropologists study time and could and should potentially study the future. Now, just to make clear at the beginning that for a social anthropologist, time should not be a difficult object of study, as Alfred Gell famously said, and he's one of the foremost anthropologists who have studied time. There's no need to be in awe of time, which is no more mysterious than any other facet of our experience of the world. You might know that before his interventions, anthropologists were already quite kind of concerned with how different people might differently relate to time. So that's what they talked about back then. There presumably were different ways of relating to time, one in a cyclical way, one in a linear way. I'm just mentioning this here because it will become important again when we think about sustainability in its own temporal logics. But just to explain, the big debate was between Marshall Salins and Obe Seke about the death of Captain Cook, and you have a depiction of this here when he returned to Hawaii after his the mast of his ship has broken, and whereas he was potentially celebrated as God Lono beforehand, and they put feasts up for him. When he returned, he had to be sacrificially sacrificed, or so the story goes, because he returned when the god should have been sacrificed, in a kind of cyclical understanding of time. And there was a whole debate about whether the Hawaiians were kind of only able to relate to time cyclically or in a linear way as well. But again, we put that to the side. What is more interesting now for me is to take you to Hoyerswerda. Hoyerswerda is a post-industrial city, but also a post-socialist city. It was built from scratch as the GDR's, the German Democratic Republic's second socialist model city throughout the 1950s, 60s, 70s, and 80s, basically until the war came down and until German unification happened. It was built for the miners and energy workers of that by then young republic. So with industrial city, industrial settlement, and built from scratch. It had 10 living districts, and it was a real vanguard city, all built from using prefabricated concrete units, so-called Platten. And these 10 districts just grew and grew because the city was growing. So it was really part of industrial modernity and a moment of growth, or a period of growth, again, until reunification. Just so you kind of get an idea of how much it grew. Whereas the old city had approximately 7,000 inhabitants, the new city grew to almost 80,000 inhabitants within 20 years or so. And living district number 8, which is this one here, which shows the number 30, that when it was finished in the 1970s, had the world's second largest urban density in population, just after district in Tokyo. So there was really a lot happening, and the city was growing and growing. Here's an image of how it looked like back in the days. Now, when I started fieldwork in 2008, 2009, at the height of the financial crisis, a lot of things had happened. For instance, the power plants where these inhabitants of Hoyerswerda used to work had already modernized, and a lot of people had lost their employment and had basically moved away. And the mines that were active before the fall of the wall now were turned into what appears to be Europe's biggest artificial lake district. So the kind of the holes in the landscape that are left over when you take the coal out, basically they're filled with water and put to new use, touristic use, which interestingly enough is seen to be sustainable as tourism in general is, but that's obviously very arguable in many ways. Now, what happened to the city then is what you can see here. It had to be deconstructed. So people had to not plan for growth anymore, they had to plan for decline. When I arrived there, again, some time ago now, but at that point, almost a third of the new city had already been deconstructed. So here's a picture from 2008, 2009. You see the power plant in the back, but you also see some districts like this one, number 1, and district number 2. Here's number 3. They've all been renovated, but other districts like the one in the back here, and I hope you can see the cursor of my mouse. This is living district number 10. This one has by now, as in already 5 years ago, been totally deconstructed, whereas it had only been finished in 1990. This is how deconstruction looks like. You have empty buildings for a time, then they're taken away, but there are also demographic changes, obviously, in a city that loses more than half its population in a very short period of time. So it's turned from, Hoyerswerda turned from formerly being Germany's youngest city into its oldest, with an age average of up in the high 50s, basically. And then this is what remains, more or less nothing. This is the living district I talked about before, number 8, which again, before deconstruction, had one of the highest population densities, again, just a few decades earlier. But this kind of process is obviously not stopping within the parameters of what was a socialist model city. This is the local Burger King branch that had opened in the 1990s, and that also had to close because of outmigration and demographic changes. Now, the story that you can tell here would obviously be one of failure and decline, stories that we as analysts usually buy into in many different ways. But I went there and studied the city not with a perspective from the past. In the past, again, in many social sciences, is seen to have the kind of the analytic lens that might explain to us why things are the way they are. But I said we shouldn't do that. We shouldn't just read the socialist past, for that matter, into Hoyerswerda's present, but we should take that present more seriously in and of itself. So I subscribe to what Barbara Adam, another social scientist very prominent in the studies of time, called presentism, and she defines it as the fact that any reality that transcends the present must itself be exhibited in it. So there's a methodological question at the core of this too. So how do we as social scientists access the times that people live in? So how much do we kind of impose our own temporal understandings, and how much are we able to listen to what our informants and interlocutors have to tell us about how they position themselves in time? And her metaphysical argument, if you wish, is that we can't access the past and we can't access the future, but what we can access is the present, and we have to indulge in this. This is where we get the data from to then make inferences about the times, if you wish, that our informants live in. So presentism in the metaphysics and the philosophy of time is opposed to eternalism, and it, funny enough, for most philosophers, this is the minority position, presentism, whereas people believe more so in eternalism. But I'll explain what that translates into my work, basically, how I am a presentist. So this is a chart I think many of you can agree with. We think that the past somewhat happened, we are in the now, but in any given now, there are different future possibilities. Now, if you take that seriously, there is a problem, because none of the pasts that you presume have happened was actually determined to happen, because at any moment in the past, there were also different future opportunities. So A presentist then translates that into something that looks like that. And sorry for the really bad graphics that I can conjure here, which is that in any present that we can access, people are actually reaching back and forth into potential futures, but also in different versions of the past. And it's this particular negotiation in the present that we should pay attention to. The effect of that is that we then can suddenly put the past and the future on equal footings. They will be on eyesight, if you wish, and that allows us then to take the future much more pay much more attention, to the future, which is something that we have maybe not done before, because we always kind of learned how to understand the present through the perspective of the past. So taking the future more serious is exactly what I want to invite you to do. Now, I use, for understanding how this kind of reaching out into the future and the past happens, I'm using Jane Geyer's seminal article on prophecy and the near future from 2007. She defines what temporal reasoning is, and she says that there was a huge shift in temporal reasoning, which she defines as the reach of thought and imagination, of planning and hoping, of tracing out mutual influences, of engaging in struggles for specific goals, in short, of the process of implicating oneself in the ongoing life of the social and material world. She says there was a change in temporal reasoning from what was arguably a period that was filled with growth and hope and progress after World War II, when a lot of the planning exercises did actually seem to work, until the 1970s, when the oil crisis kind of hit that idea, kind of challenged the idea that there will be continuous growth. And then people kind of started to, what she calls, to decolonize the near future, and kind of what was there beforehand 5-year plans, and everybody was working alongside these plans, basically, was then suddenly exchanged with what she calls an enforced presentism and a fantasy futurism, which she looks at in religious and economic practices, interestingly. So an idea that we can only react to all the crises that continue to bombard us, and that's not a good phrase to use on a day when war just started in Europe, but there's an enforced presentism with an idea of a salvation at the end of it, right? But we have unlearned, if you wish, how to really think ahead into the future, right? So in Hoyerswerda, I was able to study how, in very different arenas, the future of that city that was doomed to have no future, which was turned into, and everybody knew it, Germany's fastest shrinking city, how people tried to claw back an idea of how the future of that city could look like. Here it's through a huge art project that was put into place in Living District number 10, the one that soon after that was area coveringly demolished. Here's another view of that. And here again, back to Living District number 8. And also here there were a few changes. Obviously, it's a bit stereotypical, but there is, solar panels, there is stuff happening in a new era with kind of, with an idea of detached housing being somewhat more aspirational than the social housing that they have now replaced. But obviously there is something going on. Now, the book that I've written about this kind of starts with a quote by a local singer-songwriter that I think captures what I would invite you to do, is namely that you should take the future more seriously that the people you work with aspire to, and try to think through that future in all the ways that we as social scientists can do. Now I leave you to indulge in that quote by yourself, and just check the time, good. And then I'll move on to the next city to study further what sustainability can look like. Now this takes you to Bremerhaven, which is in Western Germany, and which once was Western Germany. But interestingly for me, I left Hoyerswerda, wrote about it, did all my work on it, and then decided to go to Bremerhaven for a very simple reason, because in Bremerhaven there were two futures that were envisioned. One was renewable energy, and it seemed to be safe. So as soon as there is a solar panel factory opened in your city, you should be fine, was the idea. And the second was tourism, because tourism also seems to be sustainable, because there should be enough tourists around to kind of bring prosperity back to your area. Now, interestingly, Bremerhaven, which had a huge post-industrial crisis at the same time, had been given a lot of federal money to reinvent itself exactly along these lines. So they were given money to invest in tourism, and they were given money to invest in renewable energy, with the premise that this is apparently taking the city out of these circles of growth and decline and pushes them into what could be perceived as a sustainable future. So I was basically traveling in time, looking at how the past of Bremerhaven constitutes what people in Hoyerswerda envision for themselves as a future. So basically checking whether the changes, the policies that they introduced have actually worked. Now, the story is a difficult one, and I have to tell you that it's not going to be a very straightforward answer, but let me take you to Bremerhaven and let's look at one version of sustainability first, which is economic sustainability. When I arrived there, Bremerhaven wanted to turn itself into Germany's the national kind of center for offshore energy, because it's located at the North Sea, and the North Sea is a very kind of flat bit, the German Bight, which allows kind of the harvesting of wind energy with wind turbines. And this is what I saw when I started working there in 2014-15. Throughout the harbor, you could see these huge tripods that will be readied as produced there and then ready to be put into the German Bight. And then you put the turbines on top and, you know, there you go, producing renewable energy. This is the factory that was opened, and it was a very proud moment for the city that had lost so many industries before and was suffering so greatly. You know, the president of Germany came, it was open. There was a lot of kind of optimism at that point. However, just 2 years into my studies, this was the new reality. Somebody had invented another kind of way of anchoring these turbines in the German Bight, monopiles, not tripods. They were cheaper to produce. And all of these hundreds of workers that had worked in this particular factory then were unemployed again, or had to look for jobs elsewhere. So the promise of sustainability was failed very quickly. A similar but not as drastic story can be told about the investments in tourism. This is the Climate Museum. Here's the Emigration Museum. They were both developed during the 2000s together with this convention center, very Dubai-esque architecture. There's a hotel in it too. They actually were sued by Dubai for copying their design, but never mind. So these things were opened and erected and were put in the heart of the city on top of former brownfields that were left over from the industrial era. And there was hope that would, like here, event-based kind of revive the city in many ways. This is a photo of the kind of the general marina there that was put up. However, each of these institutions too, when I was studying them, struggled to kind of secure the constant influx of tourists, and all had to put in all kinds of ideas and strategies to kind of stay alive, basically. All of them were at one point threatened with closure because they couldn't make it work. So sustainability turned out not to be such an easy thing. You kind of invest a lot and then it kind of runs in and of itself. So all of these museums, they either extended, they try to change the kind of topics they cover, they try to reach out to the local community to have this constant influx of people who pay for what they are doing. And a museum of that size needs at least 250,000 visitors a year. And then that's all weather dependent in a city like Bremerhaven. If it's too good weather, people won't turn up because they hang out at the beach. If it's too bad weather, people don't come in the first place. So there's all kinds of things that intertwine here. There's also this shopping center that, again, we're at the North Sea, was called Mediterraneo, awful postmodern design. That actually had to close at some point because it ran out of funds and it just wasn't viable after all. So the story that you can tell for economic sustainability, that all the promises of a sustainable future that should kind of come by were somewhat disappointed at points, and people kind of had to learn to live with that and had to learn to still believe in what sustainability or a sustainable future could look like. Now, in the realm of ecological sustainability, and again, we would all agree climate change is happening, we have to do something against. There's unfortunately a similar story to be told. So the city has defined itself as a climate city, has brought to life a whole program to support this, and wanted to reinvent itself also ecologically in sustainable terms, and opened a climate city office that, for instance, founded the first, globally, the first youth climate council in the world, and try to kind of implement these formats in the city to reduce the production of and consumption of carbon dioxide. It joined up with all the local teachers, so all the pupils in Bremerhaven, every kid in school will have been an energy detective at one point in their life, looking out for where the lights are turned off and how much water is used and all that. And then this office itself, again, kind of became a forum in which all of these ideas could be concentrated, and then people reach out to members of the community to kind of join the cause. However, with changes, electoral changes in the government, and the Green Party losing out to the Christian Democratic Party as a member of government together with the Labour Party, they suddenly even threatened to close this office. They did close the particular office that you see here and moved it further away from the city center into a cheaper office because they said it would cost too much. So even in the domain of ecological sustainability, the outcome is rather difficult. I will not talk about social sustainability now because I did work in Bremerhaven during the time of what was referred to as the refugee crisis, with an influx of a lot of refugees from all over the world, and I have a few kind of images for that too. But it's very interesting that locally there was a real idea of, or there was a lack of ideas about how to conceptualize social sustainability. Everybody knew what ecological sustainability and economic sustainability meant, but social sustainability was a tricky one. Here is my guardian family from Afghanistan, and I have a few stories to tell about them, but I won't do so now in the interest of time. I'll just move on. So the experiences of Bremerhaven's strive towards a sustainable future are kind of difficult, and it also shows us what kind of weird empirical object then sustainability is, right? So I just have a few points here, and I'll raise these questions with you. So what I observed was that whilst everybody was embracing the idea and the logic of sustainability, it kind of often seemed that it was actually not a real paradigm shift. It more looked like a reindustrialization strategy. So an idea that, okay, yes, we have invested in different economic kind of ideas, but whether that's enough, whether that's just kind of a different way of reindustrialization, so going back to ideas of growth, rather than a sustainable future that looks different from previous strategies and policies, that kind of wasn't clear to me. They also haven't come up fully to kind of measure how a sustainable future actually would look like. So when you reach a point at which things are sustainable, there was a real lack of conceptual clarity, or like an imaginative clarity. It has definitely fostered new experts like the youth climate counselors, for instance, and new subjectivities and new social relations between people. But how sustainable these are, so how sustainable, for instance, the Youth Climate Council was always a problem with regards to funding and how funding can be scrapped quickly, or how these people might move on and do other things, or other topics might become more important and other logics might be embraced in the future. That then in general makes me ask, and also made some of my informants in Bremerhaven ask, how sustainable sustainability actually is in and of itself as a concept and as a logic. And then lastly, my interest obviously was to study how these people who endorse it, how they can foster something like a new form of agency, an agency that might be different than other forms of agency that are more prone to like making change. So agency that looks at maintaining things, that kind of wants to make things endure in time rather than change them and come up with something new all the time. So there were all these things that weren't actually very clear among my informants, and that invited me to kind of think through what sustainability actually means in this particular context, but also more generally. So to come to a conclusion, and I hope my time is not up too much. So there are a few things that I wanted to invite you to do. One is something I've written about with regards to the refugee crisis, and that is to invite people to actually provide accounts, empirical accounts of how people relate to the future. So this is what I published in a different piece, and I argued that social scientists, I said social anthropologists, but again, let's be more inclusive here, particularly in times of crisis, can intervene in contemporary political discourses by providing detailed empirical accounts of the future. I refer to such intervention as ethnographic prospects. These prospects open up the future for further thought and reimagination. They allow us to literally look ahead with the help of their own empirical explorations of the future, This reconsiders the social sciences temporal agency in the current political moment. What I mean with that is not that we suddenly should all kind of start predicting things, but what I'm saying is that we should relate how people relate to the future to others who also relate to the future, and facilitate discourses here that take these relations to the future much more seriously. What this relates to too is something that a colleague, Roxana Morsanu, and I have called time tricking, a form of temporal agency that we detected in how our informants and interlocutors relate to time, namely in an actually very flexible way in which they kind of bend time, distort it, speed it up, slow it down in their respective context. But I'm saying here that we as social scientists can also obviously also embrace these kinds of forms of temporal agency and time trick how we relate to time and how we want to relate to time in the future as well. So come up with different ideas of the future and kind of bring them up alongside what our interlocutors do. And finally, what all of that could relate to or lead to in the end is something like the establishment of an ecological episteme, which is, I think, what we need in the contemporary multitude of crises that we all live in, especially ecological one too. And again, I think sustainability remains a useful concept for that, for development of this kind of episteme. As I argue elsewhere, it orients human ideas often relationships to the future in different provocative and stimulating ways, and pushes the boundaries of temporal thought by, for example, that's something I indulged in when writing about Bremerhaven, considering the maintenance of the future in the future, which is one of the central features of sustainability, that you don't just consider how change looks like, but you consider how that change is to be maintained in the future. So you take the future of that different future into consideration. And it's something my informants in Bremerhaven had to do too, because they had already changed to a different future, but then they had to maintain that, right? Again, to sum it up as my last words, when the future survival of humanity in the Anthropocene is at stake, this is how far our own temporal thought has to reach. So it is the future and its futures that we have to account for. Now, with that, I'm looking forward to your questions. I'm thanking you for your attention. And I want to once again congratulate Sparks for its amazing work on its 15th anniversary. So I stop sharing my screen now, and I look forward to your questions.
Thanks a lot, Professor Felix. I think we have, let's say, maximum 15 minutes for questions. Yes, so let me open the floor. So you can just introduce yourself and just ask a question, or you can just type in your question in the chat box. So both are possible. There are two options. So over to our participants.
Can I also say, if you feel like, please do switch on your camera. It's nicer to talk to actual people rather than kind of name tags on like backgrounds.
Yeah.
Professor Ringel.
Yeah.
Hope you can hear me.
Yes, I can.
Thank you so much for the presentation. It's extremely thought-provoking. I'm very happy that I joined the discussion. The question that I have is actually on the nature of concepts. From my understanding, usually concepts such as sustainability develops and evolves through the time. So the initial concept of sustainability that we initially studied and worked with is not the same that we are seeing right now. So just wondering, in this kind of a scenario, how easy or how difficult it is to predict future, because the sustainability definition might change in the future, and how do we foresee this and how do we address this? Thank you so much.
Thank you. Excellent question. there are three things I have to say, but let's start with the first one. So I agree with you that sustainability or the understanding of sustainability has changed over time. It emerged in the 18th century in the realm of forestry, actually. So there was a concern in Europe about sustainable foresting, if you wish. And then it had its own kind of conceptual life or life history of an idea that kind of was attacked and embraced differently at different times. And anybody who is critical, and the second thing I say with the concept, I very much agree with them too, because there are issues when it is used for greenwashing and other things. However, the general idea that I have, or two ideas basically. One is that these concepts, and most of the concepts that we use, do have their own temporal logic. So I want us to account for that. So if we use certain concepts, they're inherently kind of, or there's a metaphysics at the core of them that we have to be aware of. So even when we use it, rather than just kind of looking at how other people use it, we have to be aware of the kind of logics that are inscribed into them, right? And again, for sustainability, I thought the temporal logic at its core is one, but that might be very kind of focused on my own work, but the way it's been used in Hoyerswerda and Bremerhaven was really as an idea that fundamentally challenges the kind of crises that they have gone through. And both of these cities have gone through like amazing periods of growth that followed with really terrible periods of decline. And sustainability, for most of the people I talked to there, kind of was a way to step out of this growth decline idea into something that looks very different. But most of my informants also shied away of redefining what that looked like. Now, your point is very valid. I don't want to engage in predicting the future. I just want to look at how other people predict the future and then offer that knowledge to others again. I also want to kind of, come up with ideas myself, but it's not that I'm predicting that something will definitely happen. That's too determinist and I wouldn't engage with that. But you're right to draw attention to the fact that we should remain open to different definitions and understandings of sustainability that might emerge elsewhere and elsewhen at any given point. And again, the category has been embraced by people we fundamentally disagree with, and it has been embraced by people we probably very much agree with. And then there's a negotiation that we have to partake in, I think, with the best of our abilities. I hope this answers your question.
Yes, Professor, thank you so much. Thank you.
Thank you.
So any more questions to Professor Felix?
If not, I can obviously have a question to you too. I would really love to hear what kind of ideas of sustainability you've come across in your own work, and whether the logic that I try to establish here based on my own empirical data, whether that actually resonates with the work you are doing. I know that in a lot of development discourses right now, sustainability is prominent, and I wonder whether any of you have actually come across projects which you think they're actually sustainable. They're not just dependent on a funding cycle or something else, but they actually have created economic, social, or ecological forms that you think will endure in the future. So please share these accounts as well. It would be really lovely to hear about.
I think, Felix, in order to answer to your question, I hope you can hear me well.
Yes.
Yes, I think now longitudinal research is very important. I think from my view, but I think nowadays I have not seen such longitudinal research with regard to even development projects. Like, for example, now in Sri Lanka, after acceleration of Mahavali project, lot of research projects have been conducted So most of them were like longitudinal research, but after that I have not come across any longitudinal research in order to answer, I think, to your question, because I think there are like research projects, but I don't think that, they have generated enough knowledge to answer to your question.
Thank you. That's really interesting to know. There's obviously, our own academic work is part of certain cycles that might not allow us then to attend to what we think could be a sustainable future emerging or becoming. But I think it's also interesting for us to define how we think sustainability can actually be measured or assessed if it was to exist. So there's kind of temporal and conceptual work that I think we are invited to do as well from our perspective in whatever fields we work in.
Yes. So any more questions to Felix? Just one question. I think it's a very simple one. Have you come across similar research projects that have done in South Asia?
Well, as in two things to say to that. There is in my own subject, and again, I'm really happy to hear from other people's backgrounds, and you have access to other bodies of literature. I mean, the anthropological kind of literature is obviously global or planetary in many different ways. You would think that there's a lot of literature, especially when it comes to kind of discourses of development, for instance, that would embrace the concept of sustainability. But thus far, I haven't found a lot in my own discipline that works with sustainability on a more kind of conceptual level and then links it to particular examples. So there's a lot of work, obviously, that tries to judge how kind of, new forms of energy are introduced in certain contexts in Southeast Asia and elsewhere. But that kind of comes to the fore and kind of tries to critically work through ideas of sustainability. I haven't yet seen. There's one edited volume on the anthropology of sustainability that came out just a few years ago and has all the big names in it, and you think, oh yes, but there's hardly any kind of empirical study that's at the core of it. So I'm still looking forward. But if anybody has any recommendations, I'm very happy to engage with them too. And then there's a second thing I wanted to say. In other disciplines, and I'm aware of their work, there's obviously a much more thorough engagement with ideas of sustainability. But what I found really intriguing, and I just mentioned it in my talk in passing, is that there's very clear-cut measurements to think through economic sustainability. So that would be the kind of economic data that we usually collect, and either it works or it doesn't work. But again, what seems to work in the late capitalist era or not is up for debate as well. So how much growth you have to deem it working at any given moment is again, it's a question that is contested. But when it comes to social sustainability, there are a few disciplines that kind of have done work in that and have tried to kind of lay out what that would look like. But on the ground, in both of my field sites, there wasn't much of an idea. So, again, ecological sustainability, you can measure along the lines of carbon dioxide emissions, right? It's very clear that this is fine. And there are attempts to define and measure what social sustainability looks like. But I think it's a concept that really needs much more work, especially since we are all more or less engaged in the social sciences. And if we cannot kind of define properly what social sustainability is, I think there's a lack there that would be great to fill in one way or another.
Yes, I think we can accommodate one more question. If there is no any other question,
Professor Felix, it's me again. Just one clarification. Now, in the sustainability of future, as in the future of sustainability, how does interdisciplinary studies play a role? As in, we often see that sustainability seems to be mostly a concept that is promoted by social sciences and practitioners of social sciences. How can we get the support of other sciences and from the natural science in enforcing the sustainability's future? How viable is that?
That's a very good question. Again, there are several answers to that too. I have to say the colleagues that I work with from other disciplines, they're not adverse to the idea. Some embrace it as well. Some really kind of work towards it. So I'm teaching PhD students that are natural science PhD students in the Northeast here, based in several different universities, once a year, and I'm to provide them with an insight into what the social anthropology of renewable energy is all about, basically. And then I always kind of want to foster an idea in them that they are part of a revolution, basically, that they help us get beyond this current ecological crisis. And some of them do have that idea already of themselves. So I think here it's a way of kind of understanding them to be persons, political persons as well at any given moment, and invite them to join with their own expertise in making changes and producing changes. Now, you ask specifically about the natural sciences. I think disciplines like economics, for instance, people working on economic models, that might be interesting to see how they engage with ideas of economic sustainability and how they might question their own ideas of growth, etc. So I think each discipline, again, has its own metaphysics, but sustainability might invite all of these disciplines to potentially think differently about the future, and particularly a sustainable future. So yeah, it's a good question, and good luck with reaching out.
Thank you, Professor. Thank you so much.
So let me take this opportunity to thank you, Felix. You accepted our invitation a few months back, and then also delivered a very insightful presentation, and I would say thought-provoking for us to think about this sustainability concept from different perspectives. We as social scientists, and also as Malita's natural scientists, and also this also stressed the importance of engaging in longitudinal research for us to see actually what is happening even at the local level with regard to this concept. I think that's very important for us, and so thank you very much, and keep in touch. And let me also take this opportunity for our colleagues who always participate in our webinars, and let me thank them all, because these days there is a power cut in Sri Lanka, so I know that they have some of them have somehow managed to log in, and with some difficulties. So thank you for you all, and so let us meet in our next webinar, which is the 11th in March. I will let you know the topic and the presenter. Thanks again, and see you all in our next webinar meeting. Thank you, Felix. Thanks again. See you.
Thanks. Bye.